The title of Jonathan Haidt's new book is not remotely controversial or debatable. That Gen Z is a uniquely anxious generation can be demonstrated time and again, both in anecdotal experiences and also in survey data. And this book has plenty of both to offer. In fact, I think one of the most helpful things about this book was the amount of data that Haidt assembled just to demonstrate this generation's troubling trends. In fact, I would put this book side by side with Jean Tweng's book that she wrote last year, just called Generations, as both being essential references on these generational trends. In just one example that Haidt offers towards the beginning of the book, he points out that a 2022 study of more than 37,000 high school students in Wisconsin found an increase in the prevalence of anxiety from 34% in 2012 to 44% in 2018. With larger increases among girls and LGBTQ teens. A 2023 study, he points out, of American college students found that 37% reported feeling anxious always or most of the time, while an additional 31% felt this way about half the time. This means that only about 1/3 of college students in the United States said that they feel anxiety less than half the time or never. So there's really not any debate or doubt that this is in fact a uniquely anxious generation. But if the title of the book is beyond any doubt, the same can't really be said about diagnosing the reasons why this generation is so anxious. Writing anything about a generation of people is a daunting task. First of all, a generation is a big and complex thing consisting of millions of individuals, some who fit nicely into the trends and many who don't. A generation also never comes from nowhere, as Tweng highlights in her book. Every generation is the product of currents that started flowing decades before they ever even arrived on the scene. At the same time, generations are often defined by sudden perturbations, catastrophes, inventions, or imagination shaping spectacles. So, given these complexities, is it possible to confidently identify a cause for the anxiety that we're witnessing in Gen Z? Well, Jonathan Haidt thinks so, and he makes a pretty compelling case in this book. Towards the beginning of the book, he offers his clear thesis. He says, "My central claim in this book is that these two trends, overprotection in the real world and underprotection in the virtual world, are the major reasons why children born after 1995 became the anxious generation." Now, some have argued with Haidt's thesis, claiming that there are other, better explanations for the anxiety of this generation. For instance, some argue that this generation is so anxious because of overdiagnosis. Abigail Schreier released a really compelling book last year called Bad Therapy, in which she proposes that at least some of the mental health challenges being faced by this generation are probably the result of a social obsession with mental health paired with therapy that in many cases is doing more harm than good. By talking incessantly about the mental health crisis, we've actually helped to create a generation of mental health hypochondriacs. And like the hypochondriac who spends all day fueling his fear by surfing WebMD, these mental health hypochondriacs are made worse by bad therapists, or quite often people who aren't even credentialed therapists but are happy to play the part. People who add fuel to their anxiety rather than actually helping them to overcome it. Other thinkers, like Carl Trueman, would actually go much deeper in their analysis. Trueman, whose book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, is actually one of my personal favorites from the past 10 years. He would argue that this generation's anxiety stems from the general loss of meaning that's been building in the Western world for decades, maybe even centuries. This generation is merely demonstrating the ugly consequences of what happens when we fully embrace expressive individualism as the good life. When we're told that we are isolated individuals cut off from institutions and traditions, when we're told that we live in a world emptied of meaning and purpose and that our only possible hope is to follow our own hearts, is it any wonder that we would create an anxious and depressed generation? And we've basically thrust an entire generation into the story of Ecclesiastes, and we're surprised when we discover that life is vanity. Well, even though it might be possible to identify some other causes for this anxious generation, it would be unwise to completely dismiss Haidt's thesis. In fact, after reading the book, I think his analysis of the data is spot on. Haidt demonstrates convincingly that there was an undeniable spike in virtually every single indicator of mental illness that started during the years where smartphones and social media became pervasive among adolescents. This spike was especially noticeable among young women. Jean Twenge, for what it's worth, she made the exact same observation in her research. To put it bluntly, as screen time and social media engagement increased among teenagers, so did clear indicators of mental illness like depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation. We've submitted our children to this grand social experiment, which Haidt calls the great rewiring of childhood. And the results of that experiment are becoming impossible to ignore. Now, we know that correlation does not always equal causation, but it is hard to justify skepticism in the face of such a mountain of consistent data. Think of it this way. If a person gets an upset stomach every time that they eat dairy, would you be more justified in claiming that correlation doesn't equal causation, or in claiming that this person is likely lactose intolerant? But Haidt does not merely assert that smartphones and social media are largely responsible for this anxious generation. He actually demonstrates why these things are responsible. In chapter 5, for instance, he discusses 4 foundational harms introduced and encouraged by these technologies: social deprivation, sleep deprivation, attention fragmentation, and addiction. A generation ago, Marshall McLuhan and other writers and thinkers were making their case that no technology is neutral. As you use any technology, it will inevitably mold you into its image. Well, Haidt picks up on that idea and shows how digital technology molds people, especially adolescents, into isolated, tired, distracted, and addicted people. Now, in the next 2 chapters following this one, Haidt talks about the different effects of these digital technologies on girls and boys in particular. One of the most pleasant surprises of the book, however, was the very next chapter where Haidt, an agnostic himself, points out how these technologies are suffocating our spiritual development. A phone-based life blocks or even counteracts 6 essential spiritual practices: shared sacredness, embodiment, stillness, silence, and focus, self-transcendence, being slow to anger, quick to forgive, and finding awe in nature. It's sobering to realize that we may have helped to facilitate the spiritual stagnation of an entire generation by the mere act of putting phones in their hands. We shouldn't be surprised that a generation that has replaced spirituality with scrolling is struggling to find a sense of wholeness and meaning in their lives. Now, Haidt is careful not to simply wag his finger at Gen Z. Much of what ails any generation, after all, has its roots in the generations that raised them, and so it is also with Gen Z. Gen Z has been largely underprotected from the consequences of a phone-based childhood. Parents and policymakers have been all too happy to plug children into digital technologies at younger and younger ages without careful reflection on the dangers. Some of this is because of lack of awareness of those dangers, but much of this is because of the enormous social pressure to put unmonitored phones into the hands of children. Many parents and teachers understandably feel overwhelmed by this pressure. It's just easier to give in to the digital monster than it is to fight it. But ironically, Gen Z is also the most overprotected generation when it comes to their physical and emotional safety. They are the generation where play is carefully coordinated and monitored by adults. They're the generation where risk-taking freedom is squelched out of fear and paranoia. In his previous book, The Coddling of the American Mind, a very good book, by the way, Haidt and his co-author Greg Lukianoff, they talk about the pervasive safetyism that characterizes the upbringing of this generation. They've been conditioned to see safety, emotional safety and physical safety, as among their most important guiding values. And as a result, they're delaying or avoiding altogether critical steps towards maturity and adulthood. This obsession with safetyism mixed with a permissive, unprotected life in the virtual world is actually the perfect recipe to create an anxious generation. Haidt's suggestion for helping this anxious generation is pretty straightforward. Start doing the opposite of whatever it is we've been doing. Reject safetyism and embrace anti-fragility in parenting and teaching. Rather than putting kids in bubble wrap, encourage them to achieve benchmarks of maturity throughout their childhood. Trust them with freedom. Give them time for unmonitored play. Allow them to take risks, some of which might actually lead them to get injured. But at the same time, create appropriate barriers to the phone-based childhood. Parents should adopt countercultural rules to when and how much their children use phones and social media. Schools should enforce phone-free campuses. Policymakers need to rewrite laws to limit the exposure of children to the digital world. Haidt actually has been at the forefront of organized efforts to do these very things. He's a strong advocate of what's called KOSA, K-O-S-A, Kids Online Safety Act, which is a piece of legislation aimed at protecting children from harmful online content. He's also helping to lead a campaign to convince schools to adopt phone-free policies, which is already experiencing great success across the country. Let me make this as simple as I possibly can. If you're a parent, a grandparent, a teacher, an administrator, a pastor, or just someone who cares about the well-being of this generation, Jonathan Haidt's book, Anxious Generation, is essential reading.